Funny how things work out sometimes.
You know, after making 3 whole videos about damsels, I'd kind of hope to never have to talk about them again.
You also do get some horrible feedback, some criticism. The more that start doing this, the more of a community will be formed.
Yeah, I do. I get so much harassment on YouTube. I get a lot of it. And I feel like, that's something that I speak about very openly because I want other women who want to start doing this to be prepared for that because it can be pretty intense. And I feel like the more we do it, the more we can support one another doing this.
The 2 biggest challenges I face are funding and harassment. I don't receive funding to make feminist frequency videos, and while I want to create videos more often, they are extremely time-consuming to research and produce, and I still have to pay rent each month, so balancing paid work and feminist frequency has been a challenge. The second biggest challenge is harassment. I had anticipated online harassment when I first began feminist frequency because I made the choice to publicly use my face and identity, but I don't think I was adequately prepared for the torrent of hate that I get on a regular basis. This is a wide-scale problem that far too many women video bloggers and feminist bloggers have to deal with regardless of the topics they are blogging about, as I'm sure feministing readers are intimately familiar with. My commentaries are intended to push the status quo and to invigorate feminist pop culture criticism, and I found that mix encourages men to remind me of my place as a woman. I get near daily comments telling me to get back in the kitchen or make me a sandwich, thanks a lot South Park, telling me I'm either ugly or hot, and the explicit things they would like to do to my body, all the way down to threats of physical and sexual violence. This gives me pause, and reminds me that we still have a long battle ahead of us. In my small online spaces, I combat this by moderating all the comments that come through my YouTube channel and my website. Even though I read them all, I don't approve hateful and or combative comments so that people who find my work can see and participate in genuine and thoughtful engagement in moderated and somewhat safer spaces, which are in rare supply on the internets.
How do I deal with trolls? It's an ongoing process. And the more popular I get, the more I get. Like 4chan has found me, and they're atrocious. And they purposely they subscribe to my videos so that they know when one comes out so that they can attack me. And I get like the most horrendous comments you can imagine. Everything from you're hot, you're ugly, I want to do these explicit things to your body, to like actual threats of sexual violence and threats of death even.
Here is a very small sample of the harassment I deal with for daring to criticize sexism in video games. Keep in mind that all this is in response to my Kickstarter project for a video series called Tropes vs. Women in Video Games, which I have not even made yet. These are the types of silencing tactics often used against women on the internet who dare to speak up. As some of you may know, a harassment campaign is being waged against me because of my Tropes vs. Women in Video Games project on Kickstarter. This coordinated attack was launched by various online video game forums and has included attempts to get my accounts banned, a torrent of hate on YouTube, plus countless threats of violence, death, sexual assault and rape.
So tell us what happened when you announced on YouTube that you were going to launch this project.
Well, I put the video up, and I intentionally moderate all of my comments and all of my feminist frequency spaces. And this time I thought maybe I would just let them go and see what happens. And what happened was the biggest torrent of hate that I have ever personally experienced. My YouTube, the comments on that particular video was filled with some of the most vile threats of violence, threats of sexual assault, all of the gendered slurs that you could imagine.
Women who not only speak up about gender issues but also dare to show their face online. All of these images were downloaded from the video game forums at the center of the harassment campaign. This image-based internet silencing tactic is not new. It's often used to discourage women from speaking up. I've received some sporadic harassment for my past critiques of movies or TV shows, but the sheer ferocity, intensity and coordination of this wave of abuse and threats is on a scale I've never personally experienced before. I'm making it a point to strategically share some of the online harassment I've received after launching my Tropes vs. Women in Video Games Kickstarter. I've already posted about the harassment via YouTube and Wikipedia, but these were not the only abusive cybermob tactics employed to try and silence me. After struggling with whether or not to make the extent of the attacks public, I've decided that it's ultimately important to shed light on this type of abuse because online harassment and bullying are at epidemic levels across the internet.
She launched her campaign in May 2012. The backlash was almost instantaneous. Comments flooded in by the thousands.
The most vile, misogynist, sexist, and frankly racist comments. I got threats of death, threats of violence, threats of rape. It was really intense.
Anita says she's being harassed for no other reason than that she wants to examine a world, the gaming world.
So with that in mind, I decided to launch a fundraising campaign on the crowdfunding website Kickstarter, where I would create a series of videos to look specifically at the way women are represented in video games. The idea being that if you were interested in the project, you could donate, and if you weren't interested, you could choose not to donate. It's pretty straightforward, right? I mean, what could possibly go wrong? Yeah. Turns out that there are a bunch of male gamers out there who were, shall we say, not too excited about this project. But what happened this time was a little bit different. I found myself the target of a massive online hate campaign.
I did receive a tremendous and truly staggering amount of sexist harassment. I was attacked via nearly every facet of my online life by a loosely coordinated cybermob. All of my social networks were flooded with a torrent of misogynist and racist slurs, as well as threats of rape, violence, and death.
We're a non-profit organization that makes all of our money off of PC culture outrage and our own professional victimhood. Feminist Frequency plays the victim for profit.
So for the last 2 years, they have viciously and aggressively come after me by any means necessary. These next couple of slides are pretty graphic. I've been attacked with a constant torrent of grotesque misogynist harassment, everything from gendered hate speech to weaponized pornography, where they superimpose my face on pornographic images and then spam me with them, to bomb threats, rape threats, and death threats directed at me and my family and my colleagues. And there are ongoing investigations taking place for the worst of these crimes. I eventually got on the phone with the police at Utah State University, and they informed me that they were going to check, not allow for backpacks and have additional security there. And when I asked them about Utah's concealed weapon laws, they informed me that they couldn't do any kind of screening for weapons, which was a little mind-boggling to me because the threat received was very reminiscent of sort of copycat killers of these, misogynist massacres that had been done previously. And so they said, I was like, well, can you at least, have metal detectors or pat-downs? And they refused to do that. So I declined and canceled the event because I felt like that was too high of a risk to put me and the students in.
Now, this is not the first time you've been threatened. Can you talk about how you've been receiving threats recently?
Yeah, well, since I announced that I was going to be doing a video series specifically looking at the representations of women in video games, I have been attacked and ultimately terrorized for 2 years because of this series. So everything from, my social media accounts flooded with misogynist and racist slurs to trying to hack into my, my social media and email.
But Anita Sarkeesian says for her, the threats started 2 years earlier. That's when the social critic began exploring the sexist depictions of women in video games on her YouTube program, Feminist Frequency. Since going public with her criticism of the industry, Sarkeesian says angry gamers have smeared her reputation, violated her personal life, and most alarmingly, threatened her safety.
It is really hard for people outside of the industry to understand this, and I think even for a lot of people in the industry to understand that this is what it's come to. One of the reasons why I think this is happening is in the last few years there's been a very strong push towards making gaming a more inclusive space, making games more inclusive, making the industry more inclusive, and there's more and more voices speaking up to demand this change. And I think that there is a section of mostly male gamers who are fighting against that, who are trying to preserve the status quo of gaming as a male-dominated space. And their reaction is often in these ways that you were just describing, violent, threats of violence, attacking our character, trying to discredit us, threats to, misogynist and sexist slurs, all of those sorts of things. Yeah, it was very much, specifically referencing Mark Lapine as hero, using his name, referencing this Montreal massacre about this mass shooting that was very specifically anti-feminist. He was going to kill and actually did kill these women because he considered them feminists, and that feminists ruined his life apparently. The threat that we received at the school last week was exactly the same as that. There was another threat that came in that mentioned Elliot Rodger, which was a young man who committed another school shooting at UC Santa Barbara earlier this year, and his manifesto was very much the same language of anti-women, anti-feminist, very deeply misogynist.
What a surreal life Anita must lead, in which virtually everything she says and does becomes grist for the great internet lady harassment machine division. Take the latest blow-up, which followed a few comments Anita made in the wake of Friday's school shooting in Marysville, which may have been triggered by the shooter's angry response to a romantic breakup. On Friday, she posted a few thoughts on the matter on Twitter.
We need to seriously address connections between violence, sexism and toxic ideas of manhood before boys and men commit more mass shootings. Not a coincidence, it's always men and boys committing mass shootings. The pattern is connected to ideas of toxic masculinity in our culture.
But to Anita's many haters, on Twitter and elsewhere, it was as if she had just posted a video of herself drowning puppies. Cue the Twitter storm. Here are just a selection of the literally hundreds of lovely comments that Anita had tweeted at her on Friday and Saturday after making her original comments.
Our culture is deeply sick when simply asking questions about how toxic forms of masculinity may harm men leads to hours of hate on Twitter.
Instead, we see a pattern of men frequently caring and helping women in situations where they're otherwise helpless. This pattern is rooted in sexist ideas about men as protectors and women as the ones who need this kind of protection.
For Anita Sarkeesian, this is the new normal. Armed escorts at public events, tracking her every move.
I'm constantly aware of the fact that there's an enormous amount of hate directed towards me.
Hate in the form of bomb threats, rape threats, even death threats. On this morning, high alert at Loyola University in Chicago. It's Anita's first speaking engagement since threats of a shooting massacre forced her to cancel her last appearance. All because this media critic dared to criticize something millions of us play every day.
Who plays video games?
Video games. The threats making splashy headlines around the world on shows like Melissa Harris Perry.
The threat of violence, all too real.
And webcasts like Democracy Now! And HuffPost Live.
Violent threats for pointing out sexism in video games.
Things got heated, to say the least.
Ever since I began my Tropes versus Women in Video Games project, 2.5 years ago, I've been harassed on a daily basis by irate gamers angry at my critiques of sexism in video games. It can sometimes be difficult to effectively communicate just how bad this sustained intimidation campaign really is. So I've taken the liberty of collecting a week's worth of hateful messages sent to me on Twitter. The following tweets were directed at my @FemFrec account between the 20th of January 2015 and the 26th of January 2015.
It all started on January 19th, 2015, when Anita Sarkeesian posted this on Twitter. Endlessly amused at detractors insisting I've insulted gamers when I very intentionally critique the games and not the players. When I first read that, my gut instinct said it was worded in such a way to draw out harassment without looking suspicious. However, I just brushed it off as Anita being Anita till she said this on January 21st at 5:04 p.m. Death and rape threats should never be considered normal in gaming or anywhere else. It's time for a paradigm shift. After I read that, I said this on my Twitter account on the same day at 6:25 p.m. When one baits you with a tweet, measure your responses carefully. At that time, I still viewed myself as a small fish in the sea. I had no idea whether anyone would read that or not, so I put it up there as a documented record that I suspected something was up. The tweet of Anita's I just mentioned referenced a tweet that was sent to her, Or as I would say, someone had taken the bait. I could not prove anything, so I left it as an open-ended statement, but I definitely suspected something was up. Then she said this on January 23rd. A couple days ago I tweeted that threats shouldn't be an accepted part of gaming. This is how some gamers responded. She showcased several tweets. People were taking the bait like crazy. I could see what Anita was doing, but sadly, all these young men and boys couldn't and fell into her trap. January 23rd. Here's what my life on Twitter has become since I started critiquing games. There are dozens like this from this week. Again, in that tweet, she showcased more harassment. January 23rd. By contrast, the comments from our backers on our latest Kickstarter update are lovely, moving, and super encouraging. At this point, all I could think was suspicion confirmed. She stirred up harassment, showcased it, then announced her Kickstarter update.
1 week of harassment on Twitter.
Let's just talk about the business. The way the business works is, I say something uninformed, people criticize it, I cry misogyny, and then people fund my Kickstarter.
It can't be that simple.
It is.
I don't understand.
To the thousands of men who turned their misogyny into a game in which gendered slurs, death, and rape threats are weapons used to try and take down the big bad villain, which in this case is me. My life is not a game. I've been harassed and threatened every day for going on 3 years with no end in sight. And all because I dared to question the self-evident, obvious sexism running rampant in the games industry. Absolutely. So I've been a feminist and a woman on the internet for a while, so I'm not immune to the jokes involving sandwiches and kitchens, which I got all the time. But when the Kickstarter happened, it brought the harassment to a whole nother level. I was inundated by attacked by a cyber mob. And I think part of the reason that they did that was because there's this sense of entitlement that some male gamers have to gaming as a male-dominated space. And so someone coming in and saying, hey, or specifically, I should say, a woman coming in and saying, hey, I'm a gamer, and I think stuff is kind of messed up here, right? That these representations aren't really great, so let's have a conversation. Let's try to change things and make it better for everyone who games. And they didn't like that. They didn't like that at all. I'm currently producing a series of long-form video essays on YouTube called Tropes versus Women, in which I analyze the portrayals of women in video games. This particular project has made me the target of an intense online harassment campaign perpetrated by a loosely coordinated group of very angry gamers. Over the last few years, I faced a daily barrage of sexist abuse. These attacks range from hacking and doxing attempts to rape and death threats made against me and my family. The near constant abuse has been and continues to be pretty awful. I have extensively documented and discussed how and why these cyber mobs form in various talks and articles.
Yeah, so Feminist Frequency is a nonprofit that I run where we look at the way women are represented in the media. And by doing this work, I have been the target for 3 years nonstop of egregious online harassment in all levels. I think it's important to recognize that harassment is, as someone had mentioned, it's not just what is legal and illegal, right? Harassment is threats of violence, but it's also the day-to-day grind of you're a liar, you suck, you know, making all of these hate videos to attack us on a regular basis, and the mobs that come from those hate videos, etc.
A few months ago, I posted a series of tweets about some of the most disturbing and vile sexual harassment I have received online. Read my entire series of tweets here. I've lost count of how many times men have harassed me on social media by sending photos or videos of themselves ejaculating onto my image. The ugly truth is male harassers often weaponize their own genitalia and sexuality as a way of trying to disempower and keep women in line. The common refrain that men and women are treated the same online is false. Women are consistently sexually harassed in ways men are not. Women rarely publicly share the details of how we are sexually harassed online, in part because we fear inadvertently encouraging copycats. The reality is talking publicly about online sexual harassment practically guarantees you'll be subjected to more online sexual harassment. I've been hesitant to discuss some of the worst of the sexual harassment I've received because I know talking about it means I'll get more. The ways women are sexually harassed online are vile and downright stomach-turning, but it's important to acknowledge how bad it can get. Because the behaviors of online harassers are often so predictable, I feared that doing this would result in a flood of similar harassment, but I felt it was important to speak out about it precisely because men use tactics like this in an effort to silence and disempower women, and because I know that gendered online harassment of this sort is hardly unique to me. It is important that people understand just how ugly and horrifying the epidemic of online harassment can be. This is not something that can be dismissed or ignored. Being the target of such sustained, widespread harassment tactics can and does take a very real mental and emotional toll. Nobody should simply have to accept this as the price of participating in social media. The tweets you see here represent just a small fraction of the responses I received within the first 24 hours of my comments about this particular online sexual harassment tactic. The responses number well into the hundreds and continue to pour in for weeks. Please note that while I am not sharing any of the copycat responses that included pictures of genitalia or other explicit imagery, I did receive a great deal of those in addition to the responses below. On July 12th, I made a few tweets criticizing the representations of women in Batman: Arkham Knight. Representations of women in the Arkham games have always been terrible, but Arkham Knight is especially disappointing. No, female characters in Arkham Knight are not wearing what they want. They're fictional. They wear what the developers want them to wear. Now, it's pretty standard for any tweets I make on this topic to be met with plenty of angry responses, but in this case, the influx of replies was particularly vitriolic, and included demands that I stop criticizing the game. In fact, the tweets vehemently insisted that this was an inappropriate time to be criticizing video games at all.
But in all seriousness, you're accumulating the evidence of sexism and extreme sexism in these video games. The reaction online could not have been something you expected. It was extraordinary. Can you describe it?
I decided to do the series Tropes versus Women in Video Games. We launched a very modest Kickstarter to help fund the series. I was asking for $6,000 for 5 videos. And when I announced the series to my fan base, I was descended upon by a cyber mob. It was a organized, concerted effort to destroy me. Everything from death threats and rape threats, misogynist slurs. This is across all of my social media, my email, my website, literally everywhere that you exist online. Imagine having the most horrific, hateful messages sent to you every day through all of those different
And you tried to communicate with...
How has the rage and anger been directed towards you personally in the last few months?
So I've been harassed regularly for over 4 years now. So that's just sort of the background radiation of my life. Sometimes it is, death threats and bomb threats. Sometimes it's just the sort of like everyday, dozens to hundreds of responses of like, you're stupid, you're a liar, other things that I probably can't say on air. And so you'll see just post after post, like, you made this up, you lied about this. And then you'll have comments about my appearance, both in terms of like the disgusting, horrible sexual things they want to do to me or that they would never do to me. Lots of racial slurs, lots of misogynist slurs, and that's kind of the everyday.
Good afternoon. I have been harassed every day for over 4 years with no end in sight. In 2012, I announced that I was going to create a series of videos that would look at the way women were represented in video games. Before I ever released a single episode, I was bombarded with an enormous hate campaign. This took many forms. One was racist and misogynist slurs across all my social media accounts, doxing, which is to collect and publicly distribute my personal information, such as my home address and phone number. What else did they do? They took my image they took my face and photoshopped it onto pornographic images. They printed out photos of me and ejaculated on them and then sent that to me through pictures online. There were massive conspiracy theories created and distributed about me that ranged from that I was a con artist, which also involved them contacting the American IRS and FBI, which
I think is kind of funny, actually, to the fact that I might be bleaching my skin to appear more white somehow. They would also send me rape and death threats regularly, as well as to my family and my colleagues, as well as bomb threats and shooting threats to events that I spoke at.
Tell me, who was the one behind your abuse? Who? Was it the video game people? Was it a government? Was it a group of people? Who was it?
It was thousands of men on the internet. Oftentimes, they mobilize around certain online message boards, so 4chan, Reddit, 8chan, where they come together and they find targets and they go after them. So it is very loosely organized. If you look up my name on YouTube, you won't find my videos. You will find thousands and thousands of hate videos harassing and attacking me. Mine are like intermingled in, which is a big issue with Google algorithms. So yeah, it's a loosely coordinated effort by thousands of men and boys online to attack women. And so you may have heard of Gamergate, which my harassment campaign in 2012 was the predecessor to what is now referred to as Gamergate, which is the same group of men that just go after women in the games industry. And there's a frightening amount of parallels between the mentality of the men who were involved in Gamergate and what is now called alt-right, which is just white supremacy, and the rise of Trump in the US.
I perioder har hon inte kunnat bo hemma. Allt för att hon i sitt vardagsrum spelat in videobloggen Feminist Frequency om könsstereotyper inom spelvärlden och populärkultur.
I had no idea that just saying that I was going to talk about video games would completely change my life. There were death and rape threats to me and my family, bomb threats at events that I spoke at. It's hard to explain really how it affects you because it takes over your entire life. I've been harassed pretty much every day for 4 years, and it still continues.
On May 17th, 2012, I launched a very modest Kickstarter, hoping to raise $6,000 to make what was then going to be Feminist Frequency's next series. While this was happening, I was also watching in horror as cybermobs, deeply threatened by the mere idea of feminist analysis of video games, mobilized en masse to disrupt my life. In an effort to instill fear in me and in any woman who might dare to speak out against sexism in gaming, these mobs flooded all my social media channels with vile harassment, made slanderous, racist and pornographic edits to my Wikipedia page, posted private information about me online, made death threats against me and members of my family, and threatened events I was speaking at, among other tactics. And while the volume of that harassment has ebbed and flowed at times, it has never ceased, and the legacy of tropes can never be entirely separated from the deep veins of hostility, entitlement, and misogyny that the reaction to the series revealed in some segments of the gaming community.
You know, after making 3 whole videos about damsels, I'd kind of hoped to never have to talk about them again. But